Okay. And I want to, in particular, obviously, introduce Scott McBain, who is a fluvial geomorphologist and the president and CEO of McBain Associates. He has over 29 years of research and management experience focusing on improving river ecosystems downstream of dams. His experience has primarily been on restoring gravel bed rivers, assessing effects of high flows on channel morphology and river bottomlands, river corridor restoration planning, and channel restoration designs, specifically attempting to mitigate or reverse the impact of dams and other land uses on downstream river ecosystems. And he's been very involved with the Eel River and many other projects in the area. Scott, it's all yours.
Great, thanks.
By the way, if you have questions, put them in the chat. Scott will probably want to address them at the end, unless it's critical, and you just raise your hand and wave.
Great, thanks again, Jane. I think just to sum up the introduction, I'm by training a civil engineer, graduated from Humboldt State in 1989. But in short, I'm a river nerd. I love rivers, and I've always been amazed that I could actually develop a career working around rivers. I never thought that was possible. So I'm very lucky to have a job that's gets me outside sometimes, and very enjoyable. When I graduated in 1989, the first thing that I did, basically right out of my last class, was started working on the Trinity River east of us here. And I'd been working on the Trinity ever since, more or less. But for whatever reason, I've been really excited and enthusiastic about large-scale restoration projects. So in addition to the Trinity, I've worked on the San Joaquin River, continue to have done that for reintroducing salmon down there, Central Platte River in Nebraska, for whooping cranes and terns and plovers. And now more recently with the Eel River, as Jane mentioned, and working with Christine at Cal Trout on that. So it's kind of another new endeavor. But as I mentioned, I'm an engineer by training, but many of the things that I'm going to go over today were not included in my scholastic curriculum. And the thing that I've kind of learned the most out of all these years is that success and failure is not usually based on technical issues. It's based on management and social sciences. So it's the social science is more important in most cases than the ecological science, which they don't train us to do in school. So kind of an overview of what I wanted to share with you today is go over some definitions so that you have better context of what I'm presenting. So I'll bore you with a few definitions, and then challenges to successes, and there are many, but then also kind of pivoting over to what are some of the guidelines for success and defining what success is. And then I wanted to kind of finish with an example of what I would consider a successful large-scale restoration effort that's nearby, and then we can have some discussion towards the end. All right. So some of the definitions. So I'm just going into the title of the presentation, Challenges and Successes of Conducting Large-Scale Restoration Activities. The first thing is defining what restoration is. So this is a conceptual drawing where on the x-axis is human manipulation or restoration, some sort of intervention by humans. You have a degraded ecosystem down here in the lower left corner, and then you have the original ecosystem in the upper right corner. So if you're doing restoration work, you can go up and down this scale with the function of the ecosystem on the y-axis. So the higher, the better the condition the ecosystem is in. So typically what's happened is since 1848, we were here and we moved down this to a degraded ecosystem. And what we're trying to do is go back up on a trajectory towards the original ecosystem, where restoration is defined as attaining that original ecosystem. But in reality, we are almost never able to get back up to that point because we still have human uses here. It's just the fact of life. And so really what we're doing is rehabilitation. I don't want to get caught up in this term too much, but every time I say restoration, almost entirely, I mean rehabilitation, but that will throw people off. But as I was kind of discussing earlier, I try to be honest about what we're trying to do here. And so just to give realistic expectations for future expectations. So I think it's really important. So just in summary, I'm going to use the term restoration from here on out because it's most common. But in most cases, we're doing rehabilitation. So we're not getting all the way back up to the historic condition. All right, so we'll start teasing apart some of that language again. What do I mean by large-scale restoration activities? This isn't, it's not a site scale, it's like a watershed scale, so hundreds or thousands of square miles. There may be, usually there's many, many impacts that we're trying to resolve over a wide area. There's many potential restoration sites, tens to hundreds. There's many potential restoration treatment approaches. Like channel reconstruction, addition of water, gravel, large wood. There's many technical disciplines involved. There's engineering, there's fisheries, there's geology, revegetation. There's many participants. So there's many stakeholders, the public, academic institutions, and there's many agency jurisdictions, depending on listed species. So there might be National Marine Fisheries Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Reclamation, and others. So obviously much more complicated with these large-scale programs. So Eel River, Tuolumne, San Joaquin, Platte River are some examples that I've worked on. So that's what I mean by large scale, not just like putting in a stump in the creek in the backyard, much larger than that. All right, what do we mean by conducting? What does that mean? So there's components of the word conducting. That means the structure of the restoration program that's actually conducting these activities. There's planning, which includes identifying and prioritizing individual restoration actions. That in sum, when you integrate all that up, is intended to achieve your restoration goal. So that's part of the conducting word. There's design of individual projects, there's permitting of individual projects, there's implementation of individual projects. And at the end, if this is done properly, there's an assessment and improvement for future implementation. And this is an iterative process. I can get the animations to work here, where we can't do the entirety of all the restoration actions in one summer. It usually takes many, many years, sometimes decades. And as we go, we need to learn and do iterative learning and adjust our management so that we get better as we implement over time. So what are some of the challenges that we face here? This is what I've been struggling with my entire career. And despite spending billions of dollars on restoration actions in this country alone, there are very few examples of true restoration success. Here's a couple quotes from a 2012 study that looked at 621 wetland projects and found that most of them failed to deliver on promised results, even decades after completion. And then a colleague more recently, Margaret Palmer, did a more thorough review of river restoration projects and found 75% of them failed to meet their own minimal performance targets. And so, as she said, they may be pretty projects, but they don't provide ecological benefits. And that's why, to me, that's why we're here, is to try to do better than this. So why is this case that we're having trouble with success? So some of the challenges that we have, I just categorize them into 5 categories, and I'll talk about these a little bit more detailed as we go, but there's planning challenges. So there's constraints that we have to deal with, like houses in the floodway, bridges, urbanization, land use, large costs for projects. We can't go back to 1848 conditions. Another planning challenge is that it's much easier to do easy projects versus hard projects. So things like cost and politics, public support. And another one is that the scale needed to make a measurable improvement is often bigger than our ability to make those changes, or it's bigger than the resources that we have to make those changes. So that's one from a planning perspective. Another one I'll spend some more time with is goals and objectives, like having clear, achievable goals and objectives. Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? Can you articulate it? Can we measure it? How do we accomplish it? How do we know that we've gotten there? There's been so many projects that I've worked on where we don't have clear goals and objectives for that project. And so it's kind of hard to say that you've achieved, that you're successful if you don't have those clearly articulated. Another one is organizational challenges. So following goals and objectives over time, there's some components to that. As people come in and out of the program, I've had periods where new people will have new goals and objectives, and they'll change the trajectory of the program in another direction because they know how to do some other technical discipline. So it's a kind of a careful balance where you want new ideas, but you also want to constrain so that you're not deviating from program goals and objectives. Another important one is the management structure and process. So getting from the planning phases to implementation, that takes a lot of management effort. And the management of these programs is not something that's all that exciting, but it's critically important. Another one is roles and responsibilities of the program, who's doing what, workflow coordination, both within the program and outside the program. And then the social science that I mentioned before is like, how do we work together? Collaboration versus conflict. I've seen so many restoration projects that just collapse because of internal strife, which is really unfortunate. There's science challenges, and that's where many of us have been trained, is on the science issues. And there are many of these, but sometimes these are, most of the time, these are overwhelmed by some of these other organizational or social science challenges. But sometimes one of the primary ones is that we don't actually understand the factor that's limiting one of our priority management species. And I'm often working on salmon. So this is a big one, but if we don't know exactly what's limiting their populations, we can't develop restoration actions to address that, then it's going to be really hard for us to make improvements in salmon populations. So that's a pretty common challenge. And then implementation challenges, it gets harder and harder to build stuff on the ground. And that's kind of what we're trying to do, is that you have to break some eggs to make an omelet and make improvements overall. And implementing what's easy versus what's important. So for example, it's easy for us to add spawning gravel because not too many people like spawning gravel for salmon because it's easy to do. It doesn't really have any kind of side impacts on it. As opposed to our local legislator's house is in the floodway and that house needs to be moved. That's going to be a much harder thing for us to do, but that's probably an important thing that needs to be done. And sometimes it's just, we don't take on those harder challenges. And then another one is that we don't have control to remedy what's actually limiting, what the limiting factor is. So in the case of salmon, it's like if we're trying to restore salmon, and really the primary limiting factor is we need to get fish upstream of the dam, but we can't remove the dam, then we really can't address that limiting factor. So go into a few more details of these as I kind of burrow down into a few important ones. So I want to focus on goals and objectives, just because I mentioned that I've gone to a lot of these restoration programs that don't have clearly articulated goals and objectives and kind of stick with them over time. So we need to develop these goals and objectives that define success. So like, how do you know if you've gotten there if you haven't defined what the endpoint is? So is the objective to spend money? Is the objective to keep your staff busy and employed? Is it to increase the frog or salmon population from X to Y? You just want it to look prettier out there? You want to improve human use of access? All these may be legitimate program goals and objectives, but they just need to be articulated so that we kind of know what we're trying to do there at the very beginning of the program and then stick with those over time. Then we need to distinguish between program goals and project goals. So just to define what program goals mean, those are larger scale, so they may be at the watershed scale. And then project goals and objectives are more site specific. And that you need a clear connection between the two. So a program goal may be something as abstract and obtuse as we want to restore the river ecosystem. Okay, well, what the heck does that mean? you need to burrow down into the details to be able to develop the small pieces that cumulatively lead up to that. And that gets you at the project goals and objectives. So you need to have that clear lineage between them. So I spend a lot of my time trying to create the connective tissue between these broad program goals and a hierarchical approach. I call it a nested hierarchy, where you can go from something as abstract as we want to restore the ecosystem to what actions are you going to do at an individual site, and that you have that connection between that broad program goal all the way down to what you're doing at a site, so that there's logic there and rationale that you can explain to stakeholders. So in this case, this is from the Trinity River, where we have you don't need to read this, but at the very top, we have a broad program goal of restore natural production of fish populations by restoring the ecosystem. And again, that's very broad, but people understand it. And then it's like, okay, how do you get there? So that goes from a program goal, and then you have program objectives that starts burrowing down to what that means. So you want to increase production, then you want to increase habitat. You want to, and then get down towards details of we want to mobilize the gravel bars. We want to scour the gravel bars. We want the channel to migrate. We want the vegetation to come back in. And so you can kind of see how we're slowly moving down to more and more detail that have clear linkages between that overall program goal. But again, these things are still qualitative. Like we want to move the bed. Okay, well, what does that mean? That leads us to project objectives, where again, we burrow into more details. Again, those need to be clearly linked to the program goals and objectives, finer resolution, and we start moving into quantitative, putting numbers on these things, and that we can measure over time. And so there may be physical, biological, and riparian goals that are getting more detailed, like increase area of vegetative surfaces experiencing continuous inundation duration of 14 days, at least 14 days during wetter years for pre-smolt and smolt rearing from April 1st to May 31st. So you can see that's very specific, and that we can evaluate whether we're meeting those goals and objectives. And again, it's linked to the overall program goals. So this takes some work to do this. It's not very fun, but it's really critical to chart your roadmap when you're developing a large-scale restoration program, where you can go from your bigger scale to actually what you're going to do on the ground out there. All right. So assuming that you've gotten through this threshold, the next thing is talking about organizational structure, roles, and responsibilities for a large-scale program. So a lot of these are very intuitive, and it's kind of embarrassing to write these things down, but you'd be surprised on how often these aren't, that we struggle with some of these things. And again, as a scientist, engineer from training, I didn't get trained for this in school. So this is something that I've kind of picked up over the years, that, obvious things is we need to have a clear decision-making process. Who's in charge, who's making the decisions. We need the right people for key positions. We need good management and leadership, particularly in those key positions. We need a checks and balances system in our program that I'll talk about in a minute, and that we need to have flexibility to be able to make mid-course corrections as we go. So once we get things started, we need to learn from our mistakes and make improvements as we go. We need innovative and adaptable people. Again, as we learn, we can adjust our management. We need to have budget flexibility, so that as things change, we can move money around. You'd be amazed how many restoration programs just get locked into a budget that just gets copied and pasted every year. We need to have a program that's guided by science and implementation experience. Again, the science informs management and can change management, and that we have innovative people that can encourage new ideas within bounds of our program goals and objectives. So like for restoring salmon, and then we have a couple of folks that come in and want to restore pine martens or whatever, that takes it in a different direction. We need to have some sideboards there, but we also want to continue with that innovation. So that's been a challenge for many programs. Another big one is that we need to share knowledge with our constituents. So it could be funders, the public, stakeholders, legislators, managers. There's been so many projects where if we're not sharing our learning, our information with the public, that the public starts becoming opposed to our work. And that's like the last thing that we want to do, is have people not supporting the restoration efforts that we're trying to do, and it's very common. We need stability in funding to staff and run a good program. If our funding is going up and down and we're hiring people and then laying off people, it's hard to recruit good people. So you need a really good core funding for a fairly long term to recruit the right people. And one of the more important things is we need hubris in what we're doing here, and we need to be able to admit our mistakes. It's my opinion, we learn way more from our mistakes than our successes. And we just need to get over our insecurities and share the mistakes that we've made and what we've learned from it, because we actually make more progress from sharing that information than just patting ourselves on the back, saying how great of a job that we did. But obviously that's a lot more fun. And as humans, we don't like saying what we did wrong as much, many of us. So good leadership, this is a really hard one to recruit for, but we need really good problem solvers. So much of what we're doing is trying to solve problems, not only science problems, but social science problems as well. We need good collaborators that bring people together, that do team building. We get way more done as a team than we do as our individuals. Another one that we've really struggled with is people that can build trust with not only the team, but the public and stakeholders. Innovators, people with good strategic planning skills, people that are good with budgeting, funding, and administrative skills, and enthusiasm that inspires and motivates others. And so when we recruit people, we really need to try to find folks that have these skills, and they're pretty hard to find sometimes. But anyways, again, pretty self-evident. All right, so this kind of gets into if we're starting from scratch to develop a large-scale restoration program. We did this with the Trinity program back in the late 1990s, and San Joaquin as well. And I kind of started asking myself, what are the core components of an organization structure that needs to be in place to successfully implement a program? And these are kind of the components, is that there's a governance need. So seeing, higher level decision makers, policy implementation. There's a program management, there's science, planning, and implementation are kind of the main components. And I'll kind of go through these, walk through what these mean. So the governance, that's where the senior management decisions need to be made. So there's strategic planning, there's program goals and objectives that are developed here. Implementation decisions and administrative decisions that are made here, hiring and firing. And then there's a need to the day-to-day operations of the program. So day-to-day operations planning, there's administrative and fiscal needs, project and staff management, coordination, stakeholder public outreach needs. And that program management then also manages the science planning and implementation components. So the science, again, that's where that's the sandbox that we're often in. There's planning associated with science, monitoring and assessment, data management needs, and then synthesis of scientific information and feedback loop to the decision makers. It's really important that the science planning and implementation takes what's been learned, takes it back up to the governance and program management over time so that we can improve our management. Planning would include implementation planning, developing designs and guidelines and oversight, regulatory compliance, and oftentimes realty issues as well. That's oftentimes forgotten if we're purchasing land or conservation easements. And then the implementation, again, this is the fun part of actually doing on-the-ground projects. So there's restoration projects, there's conservation projects. We need to manage funding for that and disperse funding, regulatory compliance during implementation, and again, synthesis and feedback loop to decision makers. Another thing, kind of getting at that hubris point before, was that we really need external review. We often talk about external review from a perspective of science. So you've probably heard a lot about science advisory boards as our external review. This is part of the checks and balances need that these programs need. And again, they focus on science, but a lot of times, or most times, that we don't have an external review process for the actual governance and management of the program. And this is somewhat by design, if you're cynical sometimes, like me sometimes, is that the people that are making decisions on what to fund, they don't want that self-reflection. But it's really important that that external review also looks at the governance and management of the program. And that the time frame for that, it doesn't have to be every month or every year. For governance, it can be periodic. So I think like a 5-year time scale for that is probably pretty good. But external review of science and planning and implementation may be more regular, maybe on a yearly basis. So these are kind of like the core skeletal components of an organizational structure that's really important. All right, so item number 4 is kind of like pivoting over from kind of the textbook part of this to an example of what I would consider a successful program. Again, trying to get towards, towards the original ecosystem. I think we're still in the rehabilitation, but much closer to that restoration definition here. And 3 examples, I don't really have a whole lot in my experience, which is kind of sad, that would fall into this category. Mono Lake tributaries probably, like Rush and Lee Vining Creek, as part of the Mono Lake decision on the east side of the Sierra, is probably one of the better ones that get us closer to that original ecosystem for the streams, not necessarily the lake, but the streams. Clackamas River is another one that we've been working on, where coho salmon have, we've been seeing some really dramatic improvements in coho salmon populations. But I'm going to focus on Clear Creek near Redding, east of us. And a lot of what I'll talk about here was prepared by Derek Rupert from Bureau of Reclamation. I worked on this project for about 10 years. And more recently, this has been a collaboration between Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, NRCS, and some others. So this is a real good success story that I want to leave on a kind of an uplifting note. So a little bit of geography. Redding is right here. Trinity Dam is right here. It's part of the Central Valley Project. There's a tunnel that comes out of Lewiston Dam that goes through the mountains, diverts water into Whiskeytown Lake. Whiskeytown Dam is right here. That goes into Clear Creek. So Clear Creek is right near Redding. And below Whiskeytown Dam is what we call Lower Clear Creek. And kind of like many of the rivers on the North Coast, salmon kind of drive these restoration programs. And so it drives it on Lower Clear Creek as well. But there's other broader objectives too. But, when push comes to shove, we're really after salmon improvements. We're not proposing to take out Whiskeytown Dam. That's going to stay there. So again, we're kind of in the rehabilitation definition here, and we're really focusing on Clear Creek below the dams. For this example, we consider the dam a hard constraint that we really can't deal with, at least at this point in time. And again, we're after salmon is kind of one of our primary management objectives here. So this is a zoom in on the map of Lower Clear Creek. So Whiskeytown Dam is right here, and Whiskeytown Lake. Lower Clear Creek can be divided into 2 reaches. There's the reach between Whiskeytown Lake, and it flows south, due south through a canyon, and then it takes a left-hand turn towards the Sacramento River, which is right here. And so these 2 reaches are just like dramatically different. This upstream reach is in a very confined canyon, very steep. There's deep pools, and there's really good steelhead and spring run Chinook holding habitat up here. So spring run Chinook, those adults will migrate up the Sacramento River, up into Clear Creek in the spring, hence their name, Spring Run Chinook. So those adults will stay in the river all summer long and then spawn in late August, early September. And so you'd think, how can this fish go into Redding area where it's 110 degrees and they need cold water? How do they do this? Well, this habitat, the water's coming out of Whiskeytown Dam is cold. It's coming out of the bottom of the reservoir, so it stays cold. And it can stay cool enough through the summer if there's enough flow there to support spring run Chinook to make it through the summer and spawn and complete their life cycle. So that's kind of an important place up here. The federal government, National Park Service, and BLM owns most of the property up in here. And then when the river takes this left-hand turn, the valley opens up, it widens, it gets flatter, and it's more alluvial, meaning that there's more gravel and the river can move around laterally. And this area is really good for fall run Chinook salmon. Fall run, as the name implies, come up in August, September, November, or October, and spawn in October and November. And they tend to focus on these lower gradient alluvial reaches down here. So the fall run use these lower areas, spring run use these upper areas. And there's a dam, an irrigation dam here at Seltzer Dam that blocked access for over 100 years. So that blocked access for spring run in the upper watershed. And then the dam itself traps spawning gravel from coming in the upper watershed. So gravel supply has been cut off since 1964 when this project was built. And most of the lower part of the river of Clear Creek was privately owned by gravel mining companies. So here's kind of a picture of the upstream reach. So it shows that steep and confined, some deeper pools, and it shows spring run Chinook in there. This is from a couple years ago. And then the lower part of the creek, you can see that it's much wider. It's not confined by the valley. It's all gravel, and you can see a lot of the gravel mining that has occurred. So this photo is from around 2000, which is when we kind of got started in this program. So we did design projects to kind of restore this whole reach here after the gravel miners had come in. So the flow is from left to right. You can see all these old gravel mining pits. And so these gravel mining pits would strand fish. So fish would get up into these and then couldn't get out. There's predators in there, like largemouth bass and smallmouth bass that would eat the juvenile salmon. So these were problematic for salmon production on Lower Clear Creek. And so the restoration program did a large-scale restoration of this whole lower reach. And a lot of these old mining pits were filled. So gravel was brought in, new channels were built. This photo is from 2007. This is a project that was done in 2002, and you can see the vegetation coming back in. This is just constructed. And then here's another image, like 15 years later, showing all the riparian vegetation coming in and a kind of the restored channel through these bottomland areas. So many millions of dollars were spent doing this. One of the other really important things here, as I mentioned, that the lower part or the upper part of the watershed from Whiskeytown Dam down to the corner was owned by the National Park Service and BLM. BLM was, Bureau of Land Management, was a key partner in this, and they have the ability to do land swaps with the private property owners, the gravel miners down here, as well as purchase lands and be the landowner along these areas. So over a period of about 10 years, they slowly obtained all these lands in the Lower Clear Creek bottomlands through land swaps and purchases, which was a huge issue because by basically buying up these quote unquote worthless bottomlands from the gravel miners that had mined most of the gravel out of them, we could do restoration in there without constraints of people building houses or other infrastructure down there. So it was made restoration much, much easier by having the land base. One of the other big parts of reason this was successful is as part of buying those lands, this area, when I first started working here, was a totally lawless area. There was lots of guns, gunfire. There was a place called the Shooting Gallery, where there's an informal gun range, lots of drugs, violence, trash, abandoned vehicles. And people just didn't go there. The community didn't go there. And the restoration program, pretty good Bureau of Land Management leadership, really cleaned this whole area up as part of the purchases. They built trails. They facilitated recreational use, trout fishing. And one of the things that I really liked is where Seltzer Dam used to be, which is just right up in here. They built an overlook where people could go out and from an elevation, they could watch fish spawning in here. So it really just connected the community with the stream. And again, when you're looking for public support, this is like so critical that we as scientists and engineers often miss. Seltzer Dam, irrigation dam that had a really terrible fish ladder that was removed in 2000. This kind of shows the dam removed. So that allows spring run access into the upper watershed, into the canyon. So that was a really key part of the restoration. Another important aspect is gravel mining. So this is a picture or a gravel augmentation for spawning gravel. I'm standing on Whiskeytown Dam looking down at the outlet works. So we did some pretty innovative spawning gravel augmentation projects where we in this area, we dumped it off a cliff. We kind of zoom in here, and then we do artificial high flow releases from the dam. They would naturally route that spawning gravel downstream and create riffles and riffle crests for spawning habitat. And then we also did actual placement in other locations further downstream, so restored spawning habitat for Chinook salmon. We did about 135,000 cubic yards of spawning gravel since 1996, so large quantities. This is about, if you filled a football field full of gravel, it'd be about 75 feet deep in spawning gravel. So it kind of gives you a scale of like how much gravel we put in here. So again, you know, very large scale. And in the downstream section where we're filling in all these gravel pits, we did artificial revegetation, but we also designed the floodplain surfaces so natural riparian regeneration could occur. So we use both, you know, like take a hands-on approach, but then also let Mother Nature do a lot of the work for us. And so you could see from some of those previous photos that the riparian community is just much, much greater there, which has had tremendous impacts for birds and wildlife, as you can imagine from this riparian restoration work. Most importantly is the flows. So the dam is still in. This is a chart of just an example year of 3 years. One's a pre-dam year, 1946. So on the x-axis is date from October 1st to September 30th. It's called a water year. And on the y-axis is the stream flow in cubic feet per second. So this shows the blue line is the unimpaired flow regime. So prior to Whiskeytown Dam being built, you can see it's really variable. It's really a lot of rainfall generated floods. So these flows would be in the 6,000 to 12,000 cubic feet per second. That's off the chart. The dam came in, and you can see that the dam really stabilized flows a lot. There's still some variability here. That's post-dam. It's a 2000 example. And then the green line is a newer version of the hydrograph. So it's a new flow regime that's been more recently developed over the past 10 years. And I just want to focus on one part of it in the summer, again, with the spring run emphasis here. You can see unimpaired flows are really low in the summertime. That was a natural occurrence over by Redding, and they're, you know, in the 10 to 20 cubic feet per second. And one of the things that dams do is they artificially increase flows in the summertime for fish. And after the dam was built, it was probably about 50 cubic feet per second. And Redding is so dang hot that that water would warm up pretty quickly as it went downstream. And it was too warm to support spring run Chinook to make it through the summer. So more recently, they've increased those flows to about 180 cubic feet per second through the summer. And because it's cold water being released and more of it, it's called the thermal mass of that water, can go further downstream. And with the removal of Seltzer Dam and the ability for spring run Chinook to get into the canyon where that cold water is, it's provided a lot of spring run Chinook habitat to over summer below Whiskeytown Dam. So that's been a big difference that we see in population changes over time. So this is an indicator of spring run Chinook salmon populations from 1990 all the way to 2021. And these numbers are similar in 2022. And number of fish are on the y-axis, escapement. So that's just numbers of adults. And you can see, like down in here in the late 90s, early 2000s, these are probably stray fish on the Sacramento, meaning that they weren't really supposed to be in Clear Creek. They just tried to go up there and probably didn't do too well. But more recently, particularly in the last 5 years, you can see, you know, the numbers have increased a lot. This is a short time frame, so one may just say, well, this is nice that this is happening now, but is this going to continue for the long term? Well, spring run are listed species in California, and they've been going down everywhere in California. So they're doing very poorly. And so to see an example where they're doing really well is unusual. And that's part of one of the criteria that I'm calling Clear Creek is probably falls into the successful category for spring run. But again, are these populations that are increasing now going to be robust and stay that high and continue increasing over time? We hope so, but time will tell. If we look at fall run Chinook salmon, so these are the ones that come in September, November, and they spawn in the lower river, you know, those numbers have been okay. because they didn't need to get into the upper watershed. They can survive in the lower watershed. But those populations have been pretty robust in the 10 to 17,000 range typically. And they're increasing slightly now, but it's been pretty stable compared to, again, the Sacramento River in general has done very poorly compared to Clear Creek and elsewhere in the Central Valley. So, resilience, robustness of those populations is another indicator of success. In other areas where populations are going down, Clear Creek has been being stable or going up. So kind of in summary, why does Clear Creek fall into the successful category, given some of the criteria that I talked about before? It's had stable funding. The Central Valley Project Improvement Act from 1992 has provided roughly $31 million through 2021. And there's been other funding sources. So this is kind of the scale of funding that's needed to do this. And, Clear Creek falls into that category where, while it's still kind of in the large scale, it's still on the lower end of the large scale. It's a fairly simple system, and the limiting factors were fairly simple compared to some of these other river systems. And a key part of that was that flow improvements, particularly in the spring and summer for spring run Chinook, to enable them to successfully survive through the summertime. If they can't have that, then they die before they can spawn. So you can't even produce juveniles if you can't get the adults to survive. So that was a fairly simple limiting factor, is that the adults need to successfully make it through the summer, and the flow improvements allowed that to happen. So it's a fairly simple approach. Another important one is that the agencies involved for implementing this were highly motivated, and they had strong leadership in key positions. They didn't have a structured program like I showed before. It was much less formal than what I had showed with the different bubble diagrams. But because they had strong leadership and collaborated, they weren't impaired by not having as formal of a structure, because the individuals were able to make it work without having that strict structure. So again, strong leadership can overcome that. And they were able to do that. Another big one is that BLM really took leadership in purchasing and land swapping, so that there's public ownership of almost the entire river bottomlands, which enabled that scale of restoration to occur. It wasn't just like sprinkle in some gravel here, sprinkle in some large wood there. They were actually able to look at the entire river bottomlands and do large scale restoration. They didn't have as many constraints because of that. Another big one is they were able to bring people to the stream and reconnect it. And so there's strong public support from this, let alone opposition. And that converted that lawless area to allow people to access the river bottomlands and share in the success with all of us. And it opened up new riparian and wetland areas. So other things that were non-salmon associated also benefited. So bird watchers, again, just it was the aesthetics and other ecological values. But most importantly, because that's why we're all here, is that salmon populations significantly improved and have been much more stable compared to other systems in the Central Valley. And Clear Creek is one of the few. When the CVPIA, Central Valley Project Improvement Act, was signed in 1992, it assigned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to double salmon populations on all streams in the Central Valley. Clear Creek is the only one, or one of the very few, that have actually met that doubling goal. So again, one of the criteria for success. So kind of in summary, for program success, I'd say that, again, probably 30% of the weight is on environmental sciences, so biology, engineering, and 70% is on the social sciences and administration and management. And that's kind of lost on most of these programs. And so more training, particularly with new people that come into restoration programs, to educate them on these social science and administration management issues would be tremendously helpful and increase our ability to achieve success. Having clear program, project goals, and objectives that we all kind of adhere to and follow over time. Good, clear program structure, function, roles, and responsibilities with checks and balances to continually improve program function and performance. We need stable funding for the program, the right people, the right program structure. That's all really important. So anyways, hopefully this will, this is my first attempt at trying to articulate all this learning that I've done over the years on program function that I wasn't trained to do in school. So hopefully this was informational. Jane, I have some good questions. I have some time for some questions, I think.
Okay, you have Patricia Ann says we need humility, not hubris. And Elliot asked, does the increased flow from Whiskeytown Dam change the need for the dam itself?
Well, the dam has, we're often faced with the question of, can we remove the dam? Does it need to be there? And in the case of Whiskeytown, it's an important cog in the machine of the Trinity Division of the Central Valley Project. And I'm going to go quickly up to the plumbing here. So Whiskeytown Dam, there's a tunnel that comes through Clear Creek into the Whiskeytown Reservoir, and then there's another tunnel that goes over into the Sacramento Basin. So we looked at, can we manage the dam to just, instead of sending the water into the Sacramento Basin, to send it down Clear Creek for habitat restoration purposes? Well, we generate power out of the Spring Creek Tunnel, where we don't generate power. Well, we generate a little bit of power out of Whiskeytown Dam, but we'll send like 1,000 cubic feet per second or up to 3,600 cubic feet per second through the Spring Creek Tunnel, whereas the power generation capacity on Whiskeytown, I think, is a couple hundred cubic feet per second. So sending water down Clear Creek instead of the Clear Creek or the Spring Creek Tunnel has multiple millions of dollars of power generation implications. And so when we talked about doing that in the late 2000s, we had a lot of opposition from the power industry because they get less expensive power generation from the federal government, from the Western Area Power Administration. So there was a lot of pushback on that. Plus, if we took the dam out to restore habitat up on Upper Clear Creek, we'd lose the ability to divert water over here. Plus, the dam is actually helping us, in my opinion, because it stores cold water for spring run holding in this canyon right in here. If we took the dam out and we didn't have that cold water, I guess we'd get some from Clear Creek Tunnel from Trinity diversions, but it was an impediment that we didn't feel that could be overcome. So that we didn't really pursue that any further. And it seems to be pretty successful with the trajectory that they're on right now. I don't know if I answered that question well enough.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
And Donna says, I really appreciate the background of program and project structure. Thank you. Much of that can be applied to any other project or any projects.
Yep.
And Betsy Neal says, is there any project in Humboldt County that has had the success rate of Whiskeytown?
That's a good question. I mean, for salmonid restoration, I'm not thinking of any, but I'm hoping that we can do that on the Eel River. And some of my Caltrac colleagues that are on the phone, I think that we're extremely motivated to do that and to take some of the lessons learned from these other programs to the Eel River program. So I think that we're really hoping to implement that here. I think another one too is a climate dam removal project. I'm feeling that there's a lot of opportunity to see this kind of restoration opportunity there as well. So I'm pretty enthusiastic. And we should be able to see that, in the short term, meaning probably in the next 5 to 10 years. So that'll be pretty exciting.
And Tom asks, what do you do when the governance folks don't listen to the external reviewers in science?
Well, that's where the thanks, Tom. That's where the checks and balances is so important. I'm going to go up here again. And that's part of the reason that I put this checks and balances in here is because of that. So some of it is public shaming. This is where NGOs and the public and stakeholders are so important to. So you could look at the external review of the governance and program management, and they could say, do a report and say you need improvements here and here. But if that report just sits on the shelf and nobody pushes it, then those changes won't occur. So that's where the NGOs, the public stakeholders are really important to make sure that that kind of external review gets implemented. So that may need to go to funders, policymakers. If the governance and the program management component of this program isn't listening to the external review. And again, that's a kind of a political science issue, not so much a technical science. So one of the things, like my role in kind of doing the science planning and implementation is to try to package that information so that it can be used by the governance and program management. So to give them the tools of translating the science into something that can be actionable on the governance and program management side of things. But, that's a huge challenge that Tom and myself and others have really struggled with our entire career.
And Ross asks, how is the Upper Trinity doing after modifying the banks and increasing the flows? What has been very helpful on the Trinity?
Well, this is one of it's not our successes because we're still struggling with this. So some of the intermediate objectives of improving the channel condition, we've achieved those objectives, but our ending currency of number of adult Chinook has not responded. And that's been one of our biggest challenges. We've been monitoring to show that we're producing more juvenile fish out of the system. So I think that we can infer that some of the habitat benefits that we've achieved in that where most of our restoration work has occurred on the Trinity is producing more juveniles, but those aren't parlaying into more adults coming back. And we don't know necessarily the answer to that reason. We have some hypotheses about it. It could be the lower Klamath is, killing the fish that we're producing out of the Trinity, the juveniles. It could be ocean conditions. It could be estuary conditions, water quality issues on the Klamath. So it's taken us 20 plus years to come to the point where, we have that humility where we're actually doing a limiting factors analysis now. It's just been started to look at all these issues and say, can we explain, why we're not getting the adults back that we were expecting with all this work that's been done on the Trinity? So that is just, we should be much more nimble than having to wait 20, 25 years to have an answer to that question. And that's been one of my personal, failures that we've had to wait so long, but it's underway now.
And Christine says, great presentation. Thank you, Scott. And Elliot asks, wolves in Yellowstone changed the entire ecosystem. What chance is there for our better appreciation for predators to be introduced locally or on Clear Creek?
Well, certainly the bears are probably benefiting a lot from these. So it's part of the ecosystem process. So, raccoons and other, mammals and birds, eagles, et cetera, would all benefit from improved salmon production on these systems. Another one that we kind of lose touch with sometimes is it's kind of looking at not just predators, but what is the energy input from the ocean that's contributed to these watersheds from salmon. So you just think about all these ocean nutrients that are swimming upstream and spawning and dying in this upper watershed. So it feeds bears and other predators, but it's also feeding the fish, and it's feeding the aquatic insects that feed the juvenile fish, the eggs themselves. When they spawn, a portion of the juvenile salmonids are eating those eggs. So there's this whole nutrient energy balance that depended on salmon that's been lost. And we see that in Alaska where the systems are still functioning well. So that's hopefully going to be another benefit that we haven't really looked at too much that we hope we'll see if we can start recovering some of these salmon populations in California.
Are you also looking at the benefits to the redwoods and the trees?
That's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm no expert at that, but intuitively it makes sense that, you're getting all this nutrients that coming from the ocean. It's reseeding the watershed with these nutrients.
And what is the role of what is the role of the Indian tribes? What are the roles of the Indian tribes in making all this happen?
It just depends on where you're at. And their role in like this organizational structure here varies depending on where we're at. So like on the San Joaquin, the San Joaquin Basin, tribal participation is very small, and we're working hard to, they're less organized. There's more rancherias, and we're trying to get them engaged in this process. Whereas on the North Coast, obviously, the tribes are very engaged in the governance, program management, science planning, and implementation. They're doing it all. So, that's one of the things we've been trying to increase their participation in this, and with training and staffing and equipment, and to try to improve their ability to participate in these programs. So I think it's an upward trajectory.
And of the organizations that you work with, the NGOs, which ones have been most influential, do you think?
Oh, of course, CalTrout. But it just depends on the region, but CalTrout and Trout Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, and I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble for not mentioning a bunch of others. But there's a lot of coordination that occurs with the NGOs, and so yeah, they've been really instrumental in making this happen.
It's part of putting political pressure on the funders, right?
Yeah, it's more than it's that, but it's also doing the planning, design, and implementation on a lot of these projects, and that's part of where do they have this? It's part of the team. So like any one agency, they can't do it all. And so that's where developing a team as part of a program, that's where you multiply your effectiveness by, it's like, oh, we don't have bandwidth to do this, but CalTrout or a different tribe or somebody can pick this up, and you just get more done with, many hands accomplish the work. So.
And Chris asks, what, if any, future restoration goals with the Whiskey Town Dam and river systems? What are there? What are they? Are they just hopes?
Well, I think a lot of the projects have been completed. And so as part of the planning process, we prioritize and sequence the restoration actions. So we want to do the best bang for the buck right at the very beginning, like taking out like Seltzer Dam removal. I mean, that's just like that's the first thing that we need to do, because if you don't do it, you can't possibly get spring run. And then we need to provide the flow. So there's a logical sequencing of projects. And so I think the first tier of those projects have largely been completed, and that would include a lot of the valley bottom restoration projects in the lower section of the creek. There's another fish passage. It's a modest fish passage impediment just upstream of the Sacramento River. So I think that's probably one of the next ones on the list. And then they might start moving towards doing some, adding some like large wood to the stream and adding more wood to the system to improve the quality of habitat that they've restored. But that's a good question. I'm not sure what's kind of next on the list. But at some point, we would come to a place where we've restored fish populations, and the system is self-maintaining. And because we kept the dam there, we still have to add gravel and maybe some wood, because the dam blocks off wood and gravel from the upper watershed. But that's a much easier job than, the $31+ million that we've already spent. That may be a couple $100,000 a year instead of millions of dollars. So that would be nice if we can get to that point. And out of all of them, I think Clear Creek is getting pretty close to that point.
Okay, and you have a thank you from Tom for the presentation. Keep up the great work, and an iPhone, whoever that is. Thanks for the education on stream restoration. Your knowledge and organizational skills are invaluable. I look forward to future presentations. And Doug Durham, excellent presentation. Great breakdown of the components that make up a program. And then, is there a role for beavers? Is anybody putting beavers back in the streams?
Oh yeah. Well, I didn't get into that, but there's a lot of different new restoration techniques that are being brought into this, and beaver dam analogs, they call them BDAs, beaver dam analogs. So creating conditions to encourage beavers to recolonize is something that we're doing in restoration. Many of our restoration projects, in the 60s and 70s, we used to think that we needed to take large wood out of streams because it was just a big mess in these streams. And we've learned since the 60s and 70s that large wood slows the water down, allows gravel to deposit, and creates, hiding places for fish. So cover, good feeding areas, and just reduces the velocities of the flow during the winter times. If you take that wood out, and now we're trying to slow the water back down again by adding large wood and adding beaver dam analogs to encourage beavers to create dams. That is a way to slow that water down and create gravel deposition. And so that's one of the many tools in our tool bag now. Another is just to, over widen the channel and give the river space to move around. And if it has a good gravel supply, and if it has good water supply, including floods and large wood supply, let the river restore itself and just take a less hands-on approach, as long as you can provide the space, which is, kind of what we did on Clear Creek. Is if we buy the river bottomlands and fill in the gravel mining pits. So if this is kind of like filled into a floodplain, the channel can migrate back and forth safely without, capturing a gravel mining pit. The river just heals itself. And as it migrates across the channel, it creates new floodplains, and it creates new riparian vegetation, and creates new log jams. It can just heal itself. And that's where we can have less intervention, and we can kind of step away with this active management of the river and let it get back to nature, and then we can move on to some other high priority streams.
Is
plenty of them.
Is Cal Poly producing the kinds of individuals with expertise that you need, for example, for your business? And what programs are the best ones for people to prepare people for your work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're very fortunate that Cal Poly has, their natural resources and engineering programs. The faculty there has always been very integrative across boundaries. And I went through the engineering program, and I was able to have space in my schedule to go take a limnology class in the fisheries department. And that changed my life. And the encouragement by the different programs to enable that cross-pollination enables Cal Poly to be able to produce people that can do this kind of integrative science and restoration work. And I think a lot more universities, particularly in the West, are heading in that direction. So it's pretty exciting to see more of this integrative ecology, engineering, geomorphology happening. Because when I first started, there was like very, very few colleges and consulting firms doing this kind of thing. Now there's a lot more, that's for sure.
Well, does anybody else have any more questions? If so, forever hold your peace, and we're going to invite you to not only thank Scott, but invite you to come back next week to hear from the Wiyot Tribe Dishkamu Humboldt Community Land Trust, David Cobb. He's going to be, it's a cutting edge new community land trust that's operated by the Wiyot Tribe. Learn about its activities and how to collaborate with it. I thank you all, and thank you so much, Scott. And I have a phone call. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
Enjoyed
Thank you
it.
for being my guinea pig on this. It was great. Good questions.
Thank you so much.